Good morning. This is Danny Winborne. I am president of the Maryland Planning Commissioners Association, and I want to welcome each and every one of you on behalf of my executive board to our 37th annual conference. Our theme this year is contingency planning and resilient boards. We're trying to meet the moment of this pandemic right now and continue to do our work. We have a full list of panelists, and we have some great presentations that we're going to present today. And we're going to try to stick to our planned agenda and the times, but some of our presentations may run a bit over, so we want you to indulge us a bit with that. We want you to take full advantage of the day and take full advantage of this free conference. So without any further talking from me, I just want to turn this back over to our capable technology team so we can start our first session. Have a great day, everyone.
Good morning. This is Joe Griffiths, Maryland Department of Planning. I'm going to be introducing most of our sessions today. John, could you switch to the next slide? You'll see here, four of today's 5 sessions have AICP credits available. We'll be showing this slide at the beginning of each one, so you can keep in mind for those of you who are looking for CM credits, you have the numbers. The first one today is Maryland's Climate Change Adaptation Framework, and this will be presented by Megan Grenato, Senior Program Director, Chesapeake and Coastal Service, Maryland Department of Natural Resources, Dr. Jim George, Policy Advisor, the Water and Science Administration for the Maryland Department of the Environment, and our very own Deborah Herr Cornwell, Resource Conservation Planner for the Maryland Department of Planning. I want to point out that if you have questions or feedback for the panelists at any point today, please use the question box on this is what we call the control panel. Also, we're going to be doing some quick polls at the beginning of 4 of our 5 sessions. If you're having trouble answering the polls, if it's grayed out, please exit full screen. And John, now we can move on to the polls, and then I will turn it over to our first session panelists. So first one, what region of the state are you? Are you representing? Are you from? And remember, if it's grayed out, you're having trouble, please exit full screen, and then you can get back to full screen afterwards. John, do we have the results? There we go. Okay, so Baltimore, Washington metro area is heavily represented, but it looks like a pretty nice split across the board. All right, we'll move on to the next question. All right, which of the following sectors do you represent today? State government, county or municipal government, private commercial, non-governmental or nonprofit organization, or are you a private resident? And you might be multiple of these, but you can only pick one. Okay, a lot of local representatives here. This is the Maryland Planning Commissioners Association, and no surprise, thank you all for joining us today. All right, final question. So this one's designed for us to determine, what is your role in those various levels that you just described. I am attending today in the following role: local planning board or commission member, local government staff, state government staff, elected official, or private sector staff. And if you are a private citizen, none of these really maybe reflect your role, so forego this. All right, so a lot of local representatives at both the staff and the citizen planner level. So thank you all. Repeat what Danny said, thank you for joining us. We have a lot of good information and sessions today, and we'll start it off right now with Maryland's Climate Change Adaptation Framework.
Hello, everybody. This is Jim George with the Maryland Department of Environment. I'll be sharing my screen with you. And there you go. Thank you all for joining this session this morning, and I'll jump right into it. Thought I'd jump right into it. Let's see. There we go. Here's a presentation overview. We're just going to do a very quick look at how climate trends are changing. Go over the state's climate adaptation strategy background and an introduction to where the climate adaptation strategy process is going for Maryland with what we call the Adaptation Framework Project. Do a little review of how local government adaptation is being incorporated into the climate adaptation framework, and then have a good amount of opportunity for feedback from the participants in this session through the question box. So we're observing through measurements changes in temperature. This is a graph of the change in the average temperature in Maryland, average annual temperature, over the last century, a little bit more than a century. We've seen about a foot of a rise in the Chesapeake Bay sea level over the last century. And we're seeing a change in average annual rainfall over the last century, about 2 inches. These are all observed measurements, and there's a sense of needing to respond to this, and the general management responses that have been occurring around the globe and in the US are kind of broken into 2 broad categories. One, you might hear the term mitigation associated with this. That's trying to manage the causes, which are believed to be greenhouse gas emissions, and that's done by reducing the emissions or sequestering existing greenhouse gases. The second area of management activity is adapting to the effects, adapting to storm events, adapting to flooding events, sea level rise. And that's the area of focus that the work we're talking about today is. The second activity area, the adaptation of climate trends. At this point, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Megan Grenato from the Department of Natural Resources.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jim, and good morning, everyone. So I'm going to move into the second bullet point of the agenda this morning, which is giving you a bit of a context of state-level adaptation planning and also introducing the Adaptation Framework Project. Our title slide mentions that Jim, Debbie, and I are members of the state's Adaptation and Resilience Working Group. That working group is a subset of the Maryland Commission on Climate Change. And I'm going to be referring to this working group as the ARWG, most likely through the rest of the presentation, since Adaptation Resilience Working Group is a bit of a mouthful. And so we wanted to first let you all know that the state has 2 existing adaptation strategies. The first, which is the Phase 1 report, came out back in 2008, and that one focused solely on coastal hazards and coastal communities. So things like sea level rise and coastal storms. The second phase report that came out was issued in 2011, and its subtitle was Building Societal, Economic, and Ecological Resilience. This report had a much broader scope than the first one. It stepped outside of just the coastal zone and really addressed the entirety of the state. It also included climate hazards that weren't coastal in nature, and And so it was a bit more expansive. The second phase report used a sector-based approach and incorporated things like public health and agriculture. It talks about drought and precipitation, as well as all of the coastal hazards also mentioned in the first report. And so both of these reports are really issued from that ARWG group that I had mentioned previously. Next slide, Jim. In 2018, the ARWG did a progress evaluation. It had been 10 years since the first phase report had been issued. And so it was a time to take a step back and see how things were going. Both the phase 1 and 2 reports set a number of key strategies and recommendations that were supposed to help guide adaptation progress moving forward. And so the ARWG wanted to see how that progress was going. And as you can imagine, the results of the evaluation were mixed. Some of the strategies and recommendations had really great progress. They had key partnerships and resources being devoted to them, and they were well on their way. Others really hadn't made much progress at all. And so, again, because it had been about 10 years since the reports were issued and the results of this evaluation were mixed, the group felt it was important to come back together to figure out how to reinvigorate adaptation work moving forward. I will say, as a member of the ARWG, what's really exciting is that there is a ton of work that's being done. So it's really not a matter of saying that there isn't work being done and that we had to really ramp things up. It was more so a matter of how can we better leverage what's going on? How can we work together better? How can we share resources? How can we connect to existing plans in order to really make important strides moving forward in terms of helping the state adapt to these climate change impacts? And so in our work plan for the year, the Climate Commission directed us to develop a framework for guiding and prioritizing action over the next 10 years, specifically in vulnerable and underserved communities. And so this is the framework project that Jim, Debbie, and I are going to be talking about for the rest of the presentation this morning. And so with that being in our work plan for the year, we have now started this project and it is taking shape. Next slide, please. Similar to the phase 2 report, we are using a sector-based approach for this effort. That being said, the sectors aren't exactly the same. We have made some changes to the organization from the phase 2 report, but these are the 5 key sectors that we have on the screen here, which are human health, water resources, natural resources and ecosystems, critical infrastructure, and natural and working lands. And Jim, Debbie, and I are all members of the Water Resources Group, so we're going to be focusing on some of that content for the presentation this morning. It's important to stress that although we're using this sector-based approach and have 5 key sectors identified, we understand that all of these sectors are highly interrelated, and none of them are in a silo. And so a big part of this effort is making connections between all of these different sectors, as we've tried to demonstrate in the graphic here. Next slide, Jim. The other aspect of this approach that's different than the phase 1 and 2 approaches is that we have 3 overlaying focus areas. These focus areas are environmental justice and equity, climate jobs and training, and local government and state service delivery. And so the intent of these 3 focus areas is that they are interwoven throughout the entire process and the entire project. Every single sector group is going to be considering these focus areas as they have their discussions. And I will also note that Jim, Debbie, and I are all members of the local government and state service delivery group. And so you can imagine how excited we are to be able to present this to you all this morning and also hopefully get some of your feedback later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that we've already started in on this work. The framework was launched in spring 2020. And as you can imagine, that coincided directly with the outbreak of coronavirus. So although we had anticipated to be a bit further ahead in the process than we are right now, we have kicked the project off, and all the sector groups and the focus area groups are meeting and working on this project. So I will explain each of the sectors and focus areas. As I mentioned, they have their own groups or teams, and these are members of the ARWG as well as interested parties. So it's state agencies, local government representation, nonprofits, etc. So we have a wide variety of people who are helping us with this project. And for this project, we are also partnering with the University of Virginia Institute for Engagement and Negotiation. And so they are really leading us through this entire effort. The sector groups are right in the thick of identifying key goals, strategies, and actions, and are going to be continuing those discussions in through the winter, and we'll be wrapping everything up in spring of 2021. So it's a really great time to be having this presentation with you all this morning. The main outcomes of this project will be a final document report on Maryland's Climate Adaptation and Resilience Framework 2020 to 2030, a roadmap for action. And this report is being produced by the ARWG for the Commission on Climate Change. And so the Commission will be giving the group its feedback and insights throughout the process, and of course, evaluating the final report once it's developed. Next slide, Jim. So I wanted to give a little bit of more information on what this framework is going to include. As Jim mentioned, there are a number of critical issues that need attention. And so we are going to be looking at all of those different climate trend vulnerabilities and opportunities. And in doing so, we're going to be talking about the key players, existing projects, potential new projects, and future directions. I'm going to skip down to the bottom and explain this entire report and project is being developed with three main audiences in mind. And this is also a bit of a change from the two previous reports, which were mostly directed at state level with a lot of attention given to local governments. With this project, we are clearly identifying from the start that we have three main audiences. And for each of those audiences, we're going to be recommending key strategies and actions. And those three audiences are state government, local government, as well as individual stakeholder level. So as we develop the goals and strategies and actions, a big part of the conversation, as I mentioned, is how do we also integrate across sector groups, and how do we consider each of those key focus areas? So a big part of the conversation is talking about roles and leadership on critical issues, as well as coordination on how we get this work done. A big part of the conversation as well, which I believe Debbie is going to be talking about later, is that in Maryland, we're a very plan-rich state. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we have a ton of great adaptation work that's being done. So between the State Hazard Mitigation Plan and the Phase 3 Watershed Implementation Plan and local comprehensive plans and the State Saltwater Intrusion Plan, as well as all of the agencies and local governments and nonprofits that are doing this really fantastic work, how do we better leverage all of those pieces? How do we help put them together, share resources, to create this sort of bigger whole? And so it's all about that coordination and alignment, not about reinventing the wheel. Next slide, Jim. And so we think very much in mind, you know, about wanting to make sure this isn't just a plan that's going to sit on the shelf, and this is really a framework. So it's going to give some direction for progress moving forward. It's not necessarily a Phase 3 plan. Instead, we're going to be focusing on, again, identifying those key strategies and recommendations, actions for all 5 sectors that incorporate all 3 focus areas. We're going to be targeting these 3 audiences and striving to make connections between all of those processes and plans. And as I mentioned before, there's accountability and oversight from the Commission itself and all of the convening bodies. And one of the big ideas that our group, at least, I think is going to be lobbying for is developing some sort of key progress indicator tracking system that's going to help hold us accountable to make progress on all these strategies and recommendations. So how can we use a new system to keep things fresh, help keep things move forward, build in that transparency and accountability? We think that some sort of online system would help us do so, as well as make all of this work a lot more transparent. Next slide. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Debbie.
Thanks, Megan. As Megan mentioned, the framework for developing the new plan includes the 5 sectors: the natural and working lands, natural resources and ecosystems, critical infrastructure, water resources, and human health. And there's also the 3 overlaying focus areas: the environmental justice and equity, the building, jobs and funding, and local government and state service delivery. At this point, we'd like to take a deeper dive to show you the approach the local government and state service delivery work group is taking to develop the draft plan. As part of the initial efforts, work group members have been looking at state plans and evaluating the existing goals. Some of the questions we've been asking include, are the goals still relevant? Have they been attained? Do they need to be modified or removed? As well as, are there new goals that should be included? Once the draft goals have been developed, we'll move on to developing and identifying strategies and key milestones. As we develop the draft goals, we'll be conducting targeted outreach to local jurisdictions that represent diverse communities. So that would be by size, from small to large communities, by their geographical location, including areas close to the Bay, as well as communities in Central Maryland and Western Maryland. And also diversity in where these communities are in considering climate issues. Some jurisdictions have successfully incorporated climate into their plans. Some are early in the process of considering how to do it, and others that haven't tackled the issue yet. During the targeted outreach, we'll be asking for input on: what obstacles do you face? Do you have the capacity to incorporate climate into your plans? Are there gaps in information that you need to develop a plan? We'll also be looking at the existing federal, state, and NGO tools that are currently available. Some examples include the Maryland DNR Coast Smart Resource Center website that includes storm surge, inundation, and sea level rise maps. The U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit website. That site includes tools such as the Climate Change Preparedness and Resiliency Checklist. This checklist can be used for new construction and redevelopment projects to help decision makers consider the range of issues buildings and their inhabitants may face in the coming years. And an NGO example of the Nature Conservancy Adaptation Clearinghouse website includes resources such as the Community Resilience Building Workshop and Guide, which is a hands-on community-driven process to improve local level resilience to natural and climate-related hazards such as extreme weather events, flooding, and heat waves. So another one of our questions, are these resources easily located? Are they accessible to local government staff? And also, would examples of how to integrate adaptation measures into local operational practices be helpful? These examples could cover all the sector areas that are included in the framework. Next slide, please, Jim. We've listed some examples of where adaptation measures could be incorporated into existing programs, plans, and processes. And we encourage you to use the Q&A box at this time and throughout the rest of our presentation to share other opportunities you are aware of that could and possibly already do address climate issues. Within a comprehensive plan, climate trends and adaptation measures can be included in many of the comp plan elements, such as the development regulations in sensitive areas, transportation, water resources, land use, municipal growth, and/or fisheries. For example, in the land use element, areas that are at risk to flooding, that are adjacent to environmentally sensitive areas such as wetlands, could be recognized and evaluated to ensure that these areas are zoned for appropriate low-risk development. The development could be limited to infill and/or redevelopment on lots of record, and an example of that is Dorchester County's draft plan that has incorporated many of these measures. If a local jurisdiction has a flood mitigation plan, the plan can identify areas that are high risk to sunny day nuisance flooding or identify areas that are at risk to flooding from extreme precipitation events where runoff becomes a problem for existing development and infrastructure. Local hazard mitigation plans can identify many of the risks, such as coastal hazards, extreme precipitation, excessive heat, coastal and nuisance flooding. The state of Maryland's hazard mitigation plan is currently being updated, and a hazard identification and risk assessment to identify natural hazards and associated risks and vulnerabilities is being completed. The plan scheduled for approval in 2021 will include a set of mitigation actions that will be developed into a comprehensive strategy to increase the resiliency of the state. Elements and resources from the new state plan can be incorporated into local plans. These are just some of the opportunities to address climate in our existing plans. Jim, at this time, I'll turn it back to you to continue to highlight the important role of local governments in the process, and we'll continue to monitor the Q&A box and share comments and suggestions from the audience.
Thank you, Debbie. That was a good warm-up in terms of getting you folks to think about your views on this whole undertaking that you're being introduced to here today. And this example is intended to further get the juices flowing in terms of your thinking, because we are definitely looking for feedback from you during this session and afterwards. But we know that local governments are uniquely positioned. When a flood happens, it happens within the state, but it's actually occurring at a local level, and that's where people are having to deal with it, including local government. So I just want to walk through planning and implementing ways to avoid or mitigate impacts, responding to and recovering from climate trend impacts, and utilizing state services and resources. And I'll expand on that a little bit with an example of water supply planning at the local level. So for instance, look at water supply availability. Is there simply enough water? Many of the MPCA members have likely been involved in plans that try to match water supply availability to development capacity. If you don't have enough water for a huge development, then the sizing of that development needs to take that into account. With climate trends, they can exacerbate droughts. So we've seen droughts in the past. We do our planning, you do your planning with regard to our historical knowledge of how severe a drought can be. But one of the things about the climate trends that we're seeing is that they function as threat multipliers. So we've seen droughts, but maybe the droughts will be more severe in the future, and we need to somehow start taking those kinds of things into account. Similarly, with water supply source protection, members of the Planning Commission Association are surely familiar with the notion of protecting our water supply reservoirs, our wellhead protection areas, our groundwater recharge areas. And we know we don't want to have chemical spills in these areas. We try to avoid having brush fires in the watersheds that drain to our drinking water reservoirs. And as I said, these climate trends are threat multipliers. So what we're kind of looking for going forward is adapting to greater risks of things that we're probably already familiar with. And by doing this kind of planning in advance, we're trying to avoid and minimize these enhanced risks that we anticipate with the trends we're seeing in the climate. So good long-range planning and zoning decisions can help avoid or reduce these risks, and there's a payback to doing that. It takes some of the burden, for instance, with these water supply examples. If we plan in advance and avoid situations that can conflict with the anticipated climate trends, we can take some of the burden off of water supply system operators during a crisis event like a flood. We can also minimize service disruptions for the ratepayers. We don't put ratepayers into an area that's anticipated to flood and have problems with their water supply systems. Then we avoid that type of situation. And similarly, we reduce the costs of recovering from these types of impacts, such as replacing infrastructure and equipment or other repairs. So these are just some kind of more tangible examples, and I'm sure you can think of examples yourself across the sectors. And that's where we're going next, is to invite you to react to some of these issues that we're identifying in the next few slides that are organized by the 5 sectors that we're considering during this development of Maryland's climate adaptation framework. So, for example, in the human health area, one of the greatest concerns is heat stress. Again, we occasionally experience this type of a situation. There are particularly vulnerable individuals and areas in our particular regions where people experience heat stress, and there are systems in place for managing that. However, if this gets worse in the future, we need to anticipate and respond to that. Similarly, waterborne diseases of various types, extreme events and their aftermath. Many of the deaths and injuries occur after an extreme event happens. Even things such as after a flood, people having to live in their dwellings that then are filled with mildew, and they have problems with that. And mental health and well-being. As we're experiencing with the COVID event, it's not just the COVID disease itself, but it's the stress that people are going through with the economic situation and other stressful situations. So again, I invite you folks to enter your thoughts into the suggestion box or the Q&A box on what you think some of the human health concerns are that we should be anticipating and planning for, that you expect to experience at the local government level. And it doesn't have to be solely with regard to the long-range planning type of work that you do. Draw upon any other experience you have, and please share your ideas with us in the Q&A box. It's my understanding these will be saved and we'll have access to them. The next sector, the water sector, which deals with water supply, water quality, and water hazards. We've put a few examples there: sustainable water availability, source water protection, flooding of various types. The list certainly is much longer than that, and we invite you to share your thoughts in terms of issues you think we should be anticipating and planning for. I got a weird box pop up in my screen. I don't know if y'all saw that. I'll go to the next of the 5 sectors: critical infrastructure, transportation, emergency services facilities, hospitals, fire departments, continuity of communications, water supply and sewage treatment facilities. Another one is social service facilities. So for instance, think of a food bank warehouse. Those would come in kind of handy during a flood situation in which a lot of people are impacted. So we want to protect, and some of these things are non-governmental organization facilities. When we think of providing services to people, sometimes we rely on non-governmental entities to help. So they need to be part of our thinking as well in terms of critical infrastructure. Natural and working lands. We want to anticipate and manage water supply competition issues. As it gets hotter, agricultural sector will likely be drawing more groundwater up for irrigation, which may compete with people's drinking water or other water supply needs. natural and working lands that provide water supply and flood management benefits, such as protecting our floodplains. We need to allow room for the floodwaters, which are almost certainly to come because they have in the past, to expand out onto the land when they need to, and not to have structures in those areas if we can avoid that. Long-range planning is a process by which we can anticipate those types of issues. And foster resilient rural economies is another example. We want those economies to be able to bounce back from future increased and more frequent climate events. Finally, we have the natural resources and ecosystems sector, protect aquatic resources that support local community heritage and economies. We have a lot of tourism that's tied to our heritage as a maritime and Chesapeake Bay state. And out west, we have a lot of heritage based on livelihoods in the west of this western part of the state that also need to be recognized and protected. We want to identify ways for local resilience building projects to also benefit natural ecosystems. Just came across an example of this where there was a roadway that floods very frequently, and they're going to build a submerged wetland, basically an area of gravel and wetland plants where the water can run off the road into this device. And not only does it solve the road flooding problem, but the water is treated as it goes through this submerged wetland before it eventually goes into our streams. So we can have multiple benefits if we look for ways of solving problems that are open to multiple benefits. The last item being identifying and protecting your local community canary in the coal mine. You know, think about sensitive natural resources and how they reflect oncoming change. If we start seeing those degrading, we know that there may be more stresses coming. So again, please offer your suggestions in the question box. And you can do so as time goes on. It's open to you throughout the remainder of this presentation. At this point, we're opening it up to questions and suggestions, and the contact information for the three of the presenters is on this slide. So I'll turn it back to the coordinators.
Thank you, Jim, Megan, and Debbie. This is Joe Griffiths again. We do have a few questions and comments in the question box that I will go through now. Let's see, the first one, what can we do to ensure accountability on a local level? We can have all the goals and strategies built into our plans, but if there is no political will at the local level, the goals are useless.
That one sounds like for you, Debbie.
If that is a very good point. And I think that, you know, part of this process is consensus building, and we're all sort of on this path and exposed to what's occurring around us. And it's a process of, you know, yes, we're identifying goals, but then that has to be openly discussed as we're developing it. And that's part of this outreach process that we're going through, that hopefully we can identify those areas where we can have agreement on and can begin to make progress on. So it's a process that's going to be continuing to evolve. And I don't think that there is any one specific answer that is going to get us there. So that's one of the reasons why this is such a great program, in the ability to, this framework is a great program, because it gets buy-in from so many different individuals and on so many different levels.
I can add to that a little bit too. I think that one of the big components we're going to be looking at throughout this process, as well as funding, right? It's hard to get any goals and strategies done if there isn't the money. Money greases the wheels. And so we are going to be looking at the existing funds that are available at the federal, state, and local level, and also taking a hard look, or suggesting the analyses be done to help figure out what those funding gaps are. I, in my work for the state, manage funds that are available to local governments to help them understand and a plan to address their local climate hazards. And I will say, one interesting thing I've observed in the last 5 years or so of administering these funds is that a lot of smaller communities recognize that although it might be quote unquote resilience funding, climate funding, they can use it to get work done that helps them meet their local water quality requirements. And so I think that that's part of our messaging too, is helping link up the existing funding, these key drivers that are going to help push action forward.
Thank you. Our next question, it's a short question, but I think I'll try to expand on it to maybe, and if I'm wrong in my expansion, please chime in. Just the question is air issues. So I guess are air quality or other air issues a part of this framework? How will they be addressed? And maybe it's also a suggestion that they be greater addressed or more greatly addressed.
Well, I'll take one shot at that. And the Secretary of NDE always says that the first and most important climate adaptation strategy is the climate mitigation work we're doing to reduce the causes. And that is closely associated with air pollution issues. Many of the actions taken to reduce greenhouse gases also reduce air pollution. So there's another example of kind of the co-benefits or the multiple benefits of certain actions. So investing in reducing greenhouse gases also is an investment in reducing the impacts that we're starting to witness. I think also when you look at things like the solutions to heat stress situations, particularly in areas that are urbanized with heat island impacts. One of the things you'll see being used are trees to create shade and that type of thing. And so the trees that create shade also have stormwater management benefits. They also have air pollution benefits and do their small part towards sequestering carbon dioxide from the air. So again, you can see that connection there. And one of the overlays of our framework is looking at those most vulnerable communities. And we know that there are vulnerable people vulnerable to air pollution issues, and the whole human health element of the framework can certainly be directed towards the issue that you raised in terms of air issues.
That's great foreshadowing of the very next comment, Jim, which says, human health, heat stress, we don't have enough money to implement our master tree program. It's only getting worse. And also goes back to Megan's comment about all coming down to funding resources.
Right. One of the things that I'm seeing is that it takes a coalition of people with common interests to have the critical mass to get funding put into place. You know, it's a collective decision we make on how to allocate our limited resources. And what we're seeing is people that used to work in the air pollution, or that work in the air pollution arena, or work in the stormwater, water quality arena, or work in the hazard mitigation arena, they're becoming less stovepiped. So instead of seeking out resources and funding for their own individual issues, they now recognize, like the last example I gave, that their issues are connected. And I can anticipate thoughtful legislators putting together legislation that recognizes the connection between the issues, and where $1 can basically be used to solve multiple problems. And it takes a little bit more thought to knit together those issues and to get projects together that deal with all the issues simultaneously. It takes a lot of planning to do that. You folks are probably very well positioned to understand how much planning and forethought that takes. But what we're seeing is the coalition of people coming together that have common interests. And I think that's a very hopeful sign for the funding side of this whole endeavor.
Thank you. Next one is a recommendation or comment. Human health should include respiratory issues. Going on to the next one. Mental health and well-being. Distance learning is not working well for the poorest in our community. They will lag behind their peers that attend private school, further increasing the income gap that exists now. So you talked about the communicate. I'm sorry.
I didn't quite catch the first part of that.
Sure. Mental health and well-being. Distance learning is not working well for the poorest in our community. They will lag behind their peers that attend private school, further increasing the income gap that exists now.
It's definitely a concern, and even for those that do have resources, it's probably a concern. Any of my colleagues have thoughts on that?
Don't know that I want to wade into the school, what's happening with our local schools and that decision making, but I think your comment raises the importance of why we had diversity and environmental justice as one of the focus areas, because we recognize these disparities, and these disparities are huge when it comes to climate change impacts. We know that the most vulnerable communities are going to be the hardest hit, and those are the ones that have the fewest resources. And so just issuing one plan that treats everyone as if they have the resources isn't going to be sufficient to helping those communities. And so that's why we're making this, really big effort with this planning project to try to address that.
And Megan, the thought that the diversity and equity is over all of the sectors, that it's not identified as a single sector, but something that's impacting all of the sectors.
Exactly.
It raises an interesting thing that I've discovered through this whole process of thinking about adaptation to climate trends. And that is, and on this vein of vulnerable communities, vulnerable individuals. And I mentioned it during my presentation that there are various social service entities out there that help these vulnerable individuals and communities. And it's important that our planning and our strategies are integrated with those social service types of organizations, be they government or non-government. And because they have the best relationships and best understanding and best infrastructure and capacity to help the vulnerable in our society. And so it's important for us to protect the people that protect the vulnerable. State government, local government, we're limited in how much we can help the vulnerable community. So we have to take advantage of the non-governmental, or acknowledge and protect the non-governmental organizations. I gave the example of if they have warehouses where they store food for food banks, we want to make sure that, one, the roads that lead to those warehouses don't get flooded, and if they do, maybe help them relocate to a place where they're not going to be having their road intersected by floods. You just have to think a lot of this stuff through and keep the most vulnerable in our society in the forefront of our minds.
Okay, another one, the next one's a suggestion. Under health, consideration of not only mold, but also in older housing stock, the problems of asbestos and lead should be considered in thinking about mitigation.
Yeah, that's something that comes up sometimes. Some of you may have heard of situations where there are repeat floods of various structures because they're built in floodplains decades ago. It's a legacy issue. And the state has funding now as part of its comprehensive flood management program to help either relocate or buy out properties. And in some cases, those properties have things like asbestos to deal with when you're removing those properties. You have to be aware of those types of things, but it's a good point.
Okay, here's another comment/question. Local ecosystems, identify and protect your local community. Local communities need legal defense funds to fight large developers that want to change our zoning that protects our maritime zones. An organized legal effort to help us protect our maritime zones, is that possible?
I think it's a good suggestion, and it gives a great example of just how diverse this issue is. I think that we need to have our legal house in order as part of this, in addition to many of the technical things that we think about. And I'm very glad that people are thinking outside the box and sharing those thoughts through the question and answers box. So, no idea is, just please share all of your ideas. Another thing, before we run out of time, I just want to make sure that everyone knows that you're invited to participate on many different levels. If you want to get deeply involved, that's great. If you want to just occasionally review documents that are in draft, that's fine as well. If you want to simply be on a list that's getting notifications of various steps in the process that we're going through, you could also do that just to be informed. You don't even have to actively participate. I think it's important for folks to be informed. So if you want to be involved, I'm not sure what the best way of doing that is. Maybe Joe has a suggestion.
Well, your contact information is here on the screen. That's probably the best, but you can always contact me as well, because I mean, our department will be involved throughout. Obviously, we have Debbie here. We do have quite a few questions. We're not going to be able to get through them all, but this is, I'll make sure to transmit the questions and comments over to the panelists. Something I forgot to mention earlier, just because we always get this question, we are recording all these sessions. We will split them up and make them available, as well as the presentations. Okay, so the next question is MACO directly involved in the process?
So right now, as I mentioned, we have all of these different sector and focus area teams or working groups. Part of the process that was just finished on November 2nd was each of those groups put together what we're calling an outreach plan. We understand it's very time consumptive to be part of these groups. We understand that there are a ton of experts and people that have fantastic knowledge that we would like to tap into that aren't able to be full group members. And so this outreach plan is all about identifying those key stakeholders so that we can figure out if it's a matter of one-on-one conversations or just emails back and forth. Some groups are doing sort of mini focus groups of how to harness all of that expertise. And so MACO is definitely on the outreach plan. I don't think they have a representative who's actually on a project team, but we will be reaching out to them MML as well.
Right. And we kind of touched on this earlier, but I'm going to ask it again in case something, another idea comes to mind. I know this is just, or this is the comment, I know this is just an overview, but a area has been identified regarding environmental justice and equity since minority communities have been hit the hardest. So again, I know we kind of touched upon that earlier, but if anybody wanted to add to it.
That group is in the stage currently of trying to talk to stakeholders. So that group did a big push on trying to increase the number of folks in the group in order to make that group more diverse and get a wider range of backgrounds, experiences, and knowledge. They have a really robust outreach plan because obviously this is a huge issue. It's an issue that's not really been incorporated in the previous plans, and so we have a lot of ground to make up. And so I don't know that they're at the point yet of having specific ideas to tap in. Well, I know they have ideas, but in terms of like organizing those strategies and the goals, I'm not quite sure that they have anything that I could share with you right now. I will say one of the fantastic things that University of Virginia was able to do for us was that they surveyed a number of the existing adaptation plans from counties and states and cities across the nation. And so we're able to pull best practices and gain inspiration from those plans. The other exciting thing that's happening right now is the, I always mess up the acronym, the CJSC, which is the state level community.
Commission on Environmental Justice and Sustainable Communities, and I'm on it.
Thank you. I always butcher it. 5 letters, which is like one too many. So that group has been recently reinvigorated. And I know one of the first things they're going to be working on is how really we define what vulnerable means in terms of environmental justice and climate. And so that group we anticipate is going to be coming up with some information that we can definitely fold into this process to help us.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. I apologize for those I could not get to. I was taking them in order of them coming in, but again, I will pass them on. We want to stay on schedule and get to our next session. So the last one is always good to keep in mind the interconnectivity of planning and engineering and the benefits on interdisciplinary teams in problem solving.
You're here.
100%. Yes. And I will say, Jim and I have been involved in a lot of conversations happening around extreme precipitation and precipitation modeling that, yes, involves a lot of engineering discussions, but we're trying to bring in sort of the planning side and local practitioner side because it's really helpful to have that balance when organizing those projects.
And I think, Megan, the sector groups really reflect that this process is definitely bringing those participants to the table. So I think that, you know, the plan will be stronger because of that.
Well, I just want to thank you 3 for joining us first thing on a Monday morning. Megan, Jim, and Debbie. I know that this will be work that continues for a while. We appreciate all the great comments, and you have contact information for everybody involved if you have more additional questions or want to make sure you stay involved. So thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your day. Hope you can join us for one or more sessions, but if not, I know we're all very busy folks. So enjoy your week.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate you all participating.